Living in supported accommodation as a person with a disability and the causes and effects of disadvantage and marginalisation. People with a disability who live in supported accommodation experience disadvantage and marginalisation, and taking a holistic look, the welfare system is a critical component of understanding why and how these people experience disadvantage and marginalisation. Supported accommodation is a service provided by governments, non-government and private organisations, which can be accessed by many people with a disability who require high support needs. Support workers support the participants to live as independently as possible by assisting with the basic necessities of living, such as personal care, medical and social needs, and day-to-day activities such as banking, meal preparation, and household maintenance. Many living in supported accommodation often live with several other people. The National Disability Insurance Agency, or NDIA, the governing body for the National Disability Insurance Scheme, NDIS, offers two main types of welfare benefits for eligible participants. Supported independent living, often referred to as SIL. SIL funding is targeted towards providing participants with the support they need, often in a shared home. Some types of support include meal preparation, medication administration, cleaning, and social inclusion within the community. The other type is specialist disability accommodation, often referred to as SDA. SDA funding is targeted towards people who are in need of specialist housing to accommodate the need of their disability. This might include ramps in place of stairs and wide hallways or door frames for wheelchair access. Depending on the support requirements, some people can access both types of funding. This presentation looks at 5 significant areas of disadvantage and marginalisation of people with a disability who live in supported accommodation. These are stigmatisation and discrimination within the workforce, social inclusion within their communities, access to funding and limitations of choice and control about their accommodation, and violence, abuse, and neglect. A major aspect of living in supported accommodation is assistance with accessing the support a person may need to participate in the labour force if they choose. People living in supported accommodation may need help getting to and from work, preparing a packed lunch, or attending to personal care needs before they head off to their workplace. Although many living in supported accommodation are unable to work due to severe physical or intellectual disabilities, a lot of people living in supported accommodation want to work as it is an opportunity to earn some extra spending money and socialize with others outside of their supported accommodation arrangements. 84.1% of people without a disability are in the labour force. In contrast, 53.4% of people with a disability are in the labour force. Of the 46.6% of people with a disability not in the labour force, a majority, 58.7%, are unable to work, and almost a quarter, 23.4%, intend to work or look for work. A 2021 NDIS quarterly report states that the labour force participation rate has increased from 12 to 21%, people aged 15 to 24 years, but a decrease from 22 to 21% for participants aged 25 and older. Overall participation in the workforce has increased from 21 to 22% for people living with a disability aged 15 and older. There is a significant disparity in workforce participation between people with a disability and those without a disability, many of whom live in supported accommodation. These people are often stigmatized as unable to cope with workplace pressures, or may be seen as a burden on the organisation. The Australian Financial Review reports that first chairman of the NDIS, Professor Bruce Bonyhady, suggested that employers need to foster a culture of inclusion towards people with a disability within their workplaces. Mental health is a critical issue for people living in supported accommodation, and exclusion from the workforce increases this risk, as people living with a disability are often prevented from earning extra income so that they can put towards social activities, and this can have a major impact on a person's sense of self-worth. People with a disability often have limited social circles, with few to no friends, where most of those connections are with people within the familial group. People living with a physical and/or intellectual disability are often excluded from social groups such as sports teams, men's and women's sheds, and online gaming groups. People may hold preconceptions that a person with a physical disability is unable to be an effective participant in a sports team, or that they may be an unwanted burden, especially in competitive groups. Similarly, people with an intellectual disability are often excluded from social groups because of their social skills or lack of perceived stimulating conversation. More and more services and social groups are accessed digitally, and many people with disability can find it difficult to participate as many of these groups maintain schedules or hold discussions online, which is often enigmatic and difficult to use for people with a disability. Many studies have shown that many people living with an intellectual disability believe they are likely to only develop strong friendships with other people with intellectual disabilities. The location of supported accommodation housing is a limiting factor in social inclusion, as many houses are in less densely populated areas where housing is cheaper and where social groups are limited. Distance from social groups in more populated areas may be difficult to access due to funding for travel and one-on-one individualized supports. Since supported accommodation is often staffed with 1 to 2 support workers to several participants, social activities are limited to the capacity of these workers to meet each of the participants' individual needs. Finding adequate support for individualized outings can also be difficult to access, as there is a nationwide shortage of support workers. A report on supported independent living conducted by the Joint Committee on the National Disability Insurance Scheme found that the applicants thought applying for SIL funding was an arduous process. Applicants reported it was lengthy, and people who had never accessed supported accommodation services previously had difficulties gathering the large volume of evidence required to support their eligibility for NDIS funding. Housing affordability in Australia is a significant issue currently, and due to the dependence on government welfare of people with a disability, this has left many people to struggle with finding appropriate and affordable housing. The Sydney Morning Herald provides data sourced from CoreLogic, a widely respected tool used by many property investors. The reports from July 2017 to July 2022, median house prices in Sydney have increased from roughly $950,000 to over $1.3 million. In 2016, the NDIA committed to an annual budget of roughly $700 million for specialist disability accommodation services. In 2021, only 31% of the $700 million made its way to participants accessing SDA. This presents an issue with accessibility for participants who require these funds for suitable housing. In January 2022, there were almost 4,000 younger people under the age of 65 who are currently housed in aged care facilities who would likely be suited to SDA funding. It takes the NDIA, on average, 60 days to determine the eligibility and to dispense funding for NDIS participants. And as a result, over 1,000 people with disabilities are in long-term hospital stays. The lack of affordable and specialist housing, in addition to the difficulties navigating the NDIS, could be partially to blame for these people still residing in facilities which are not targeted towards them. Of the 500,000 participants, Professor Bonnie Haiti said nearly 290,000 are receiving benefits for the first time. Quote, "That tells you a lot about how underfunded and how much of a lottery the pre-NDIS system was, so the need for this scheme is indisputable." People living in supported accommodation are at a greater risk of violence, abuse, and neglect than the general population. For example, 40% of women with a disability have experienced violence compared to 26% of women without a disability. Also, from the ages of 15, 46% of women with an intellectual disability have experienced sexual violence, compared to 16% of women without a disability. People with a disability living in group homes depend heavily on their support providers to be effective advocates on their behalf, especially when they have little to no family contact. This presents an issue in cases where a person's most effective advocate may also be the perpetrator of violence. The Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of People with a Disability found that many respondents detailed examples of incidents of violence, abuse and neglect, such as sexual and physical assault and verbal abuse from staff, volunteers, community members and other residents of their supported accommodation arrangements. Several respondents even stated that they were aware of ongoing violence between residents and incidents where individuals were forced to decide between remaining in the group home, where the violence was occurring, or becoming homeless. In conclusion, workplace discrimination and access to the labour force is difficult for many people living with a disability in supported accommodation. People living with a disability can become socially isolated due to factors outside of their control, and access to funding for supported accommodation can be a confusing and lengthy process, which leads to people being forced into less than ideal living arrangements. Finally, violence, abuse, and neglect within supported accommodation remains a significant issue as residents are highly dependent on service providers and support staff, and that some people are left with difficult choices about remaining in a situation where violence is occurring or becoming homeless.